Welcome to this ICPVTR webinar on crime terror nexus in the digital age. This webinar will touch on various topics related to terrorism financing, such as crime terror nexus, cryptocurrency, and the dark net. Our guest speaker today is Mr. David Winston, an international security analyst who is joining us all the way from California. Welcome, David. Good to have you with us. Just to give a brief introduction of David, he's currently a research data specialist for the state of California. He was formerly a senior research fellow for the Asia Pacific Foundation, where he advised governments on global security issues. David has consulted for and has been a member of various eminent organizations. He's also the author of Narcotics in Security, Inc., The Convergence of the Narcotics Underworld and Extremists in Afghanistan and Pakistan, and its Global Proliferation. This webinar will start with David's presentation, followed by a Q&A. If you have any questions, please write them in the chat box and I will direct that to David, direct your questions to David after his presentation. So without further ado, let me now hand it over to David for his presentation.
Thanks so much, Callie. Happy to be with you all today. Early in the morning for you, but actually the evening for me in California. Going to be sharing my screen. Just let me know, Callie, if you can see it. Does everything look good?
Yes, all looks good.
Perfect. Okay. Yes, thank you again for the introduction and appreciate you hosting me today. So I'll be speaking with you about the crime terror nexus in the digital age. My presentation will cover both the connection between terrorist organizations and criminal organizations and how they've developed over the past few decades, as well as touching on a lot of the advancements in digital technologies that criminal and terrorist organizations have been utilizing increasingly to both have covert funding for their operations, covert communications, and to evade law enforcement while they're engaging in these funding activities for funding terrorist activity. So first, here we go. Let's look at the crime-terror symbiosis. So with terrorist activity and criminal activity, we have a vicious cycle formed where the more terrorist activity you have in a certain area, the less opportunity you have for licit or legal commercial activity. If, for instance, there's a lot of terrorist attacks or if there's known terrorist entities operating in an area, it's much less likely you'd be able to have a profitable business. So because of this, you have increased insecurity, and the people living in that community, living in that area, are more likely to need to resort to engaging in criminal activity, such as narcotics trafficking, weapons smuggling, and any other kinds of smuggling activities, which we'll get to further into in the presentation. And this forms a vicious cycle where the more terrorist activity you have, the more criminal activity you have. And as you increase criminal activity to for people who are just trying to, get by economically, they end up funding the very terrorist activity that makes those areas so insecure in the first place. And we've seen a major increase in collaboration in illicit activity. So we have criminal organizations and terrorist groups that are working together increasingly instead of competing in the same industry. So something that's a pretty novel phenomenon is the collaboration between criminal organizations in terrorist activity. So for instance, we have collaboration in drug trafficking. I think a lot of people assume, from looking at historically the way cartel organizations have operated, that there's a lot of rivalry and competition within the narcotics industry. But actually what we've been seeing, especially out of South Asia, is that there's increasing collaboration in this realm. So we have drug trafficking organizations that are often sharing opiates precursor chemicals, access to heroin refining labs with terrorist organizations. And then we have, in exchange, terrorist organizations are providing access to smuggling routes and providing protection along those routes to drug trafficking organizations. And over several decades, we've seen drug trafficking organizations forming larger and larger networks with other organizations and becoming more integrated as they share their resources. So especially out of South Asia, most drug trafficking organizations operate in very small cells, maybe four to six people, formed from kinship bonds, trusted bonds, and they connect with other small cells operating in nearby regions in order to evade detection from security services, in order to share precursor chemicals. For instance, if one group has access to precursor chemicals to refine heroin and the other one has access to raw opium, they're more likely to work together to refine that opium into heroin and then share the proceeds instead of competing for those resources. And as we see terrorist groups increasingly rely on crime to fund their operations, we're seeing a lot of cooperation between both terrorist organizations and criminal organizations. And I see this nexus broken down into three main types of categories. We have terrorist muscle, the exchange of illicit goods, and the taxation on illicit activity. And I'll go into sort of how each of those work and examples of each. So for the first, terrorist muscle, this is a type of nexus where terrorist operatives are acting as muscle or militant support for criminal organizations operating in a particular region, and they provide their illicit industry with security protection in exchange for a cut of their proceeds. So for example, Sam Gore is a very prominent narcotics trafficking organization that was formed from a network of 5 former Asian triad organizations. They make about $18 billion a year in synthetic drugs. They're probably the largest producer of synthetic drugs in the world. This includes meth, the heroin, MDMA, ketamine, and they produce their drugs in Myanmar's Shan state. This is a region where there's a lot of civil unrest. You have the Kungha militia engaging in fighting against the government forces, and the Sam Gore organization is utilizing the Kungha militia as terrorist muscle in order to protect their facilities, their drug refining facilities, and then in exchange, they give them a percentage of their proceeds. Another example is the exchange of illicit goods, or another type of nexus is the exchange of illicit goods. So this is when terror groups will exchange the illicit goods that they have access to for illicit goods that a criminal network might have access to. So this could be drugs, money, forged identity documents, antiquities. And the way this works is that each organization has their own networks and contacts that they form. As I mentioned before, a lot of narcotics organizations connect with others and benefit each other via their access to heroin refining labs or potential precursor chemicals. And then they offer the illicit goods they have access to in exchange for illicit goods that another criminal organization has access to or a terrorist organization has access to. So a great example of this is the Italian mafia coordinating with Daesh Libya or IS Libya, which is one of the wilayas of Daesh, one of the provinces of ISIS. And in 2016, a mafia cell operating in Calabria smuggled a number of weapons, including Kalashnikovs, grenades, rocket launchers, into Sirte, Libya. And in exchange, they received Greek and Roman antiquities that the ISIS militants had plundered from Libyan museums. So, for instance, ISIS had access to these antiquities because they took over this territory for some time, plundered the antiquities, and then they coordinated with this Italian mafia cell that had access to buyers on the black market who could give them much more money for the antiquities than they would have been able to get on their own, because they lacked the network and the contacts in the antiquities black market. And in exchange, they got a number of weapons that they would not have otherwise had access to. And then the mafia sold these antiquities at an auction to art collectors for 100 to 800,000 US dollars a piece, which again, much more than the Daesh militants would have been able to get on their own. And then the third nexus type is taxation on illicit activity. So this is where terrorist groups will charge an unofficial tax to criminal organizations that are operating in their sphere of influence, basically any area that they have de facto control over the territory. So this could be in the form of extortion, where they find a business operating in an area they have significant influence in. They threaten that business, say if they don't give them a portion of their revenue, they will destroy the business, harm them in some way, or they promise some form of protection, that they will prevent their business from getting raided by another militant group, for instance. So the types of taxation, the way this usually operates is often a toll tax for criminal organizations that are trying to transit through their territory. So if a drug trafficking organization is trying to move their smuggled narcotics through a region that this terrorist group has control over, they might have to pay a percentage of their funds or a percentage of their narcotics in order to be allowed access. So they'd have to provide payment for allowing them to go through that territory. Or another way that this tax is levied is they may require regular payments if this criminal organization wishes to produce illicit goods on their territory. So in that earlier example of the Shan state activity where they're producing drugs in that region, the terrorist group may offer some type of protection in order to allow them to operate in that region. One strong example of this is the Haqqani network taxing precious gem miners who are operating in Afghanistan and Pakistan. Chromite is a very valuable mineral that's very prominent in that region. It's used to make stainless steel and used often for construction materials. And Haqqani militants will guard the dig sites usually around the federal administered tribal areas, where miners will unearth chromite, and then they will charge 10 to 15% of the proceeds in order to protect those mining sites. On top of that, chromite dealers will pay a tax of usually 115 to 175 US dollars per truck every time they pass through the network's territory. So this is an example of toll tax. And beyond the connections between criminal organizations and terror organizations, we've seen the growth in the past 20, 30 years of what I would call crime terror hybrid organizations. These are organizations that operate both as a terrorist organization and a criminal organization with dual goals of profiting and then advancing their ideology. They'll often use the connections they have with like-minded militants in order to enable their criminal activity. So going back to the operating in other regions where other terrorist groups have influence over a particular territory, if they're like-minded terrorist organizations that have similar goals, they may allow this other terrorist group to go through their region without having to pay a tax, for instance. And then as they're engaging in criminal activity, narcotics trafficking, weapons smuggling, whatever it may be, they use that revenue, they use that profit to fund either their own terrorist operations or the terrorist operations of like-minded militant groups. So two key examples of this that I'll focus on in this presentation is the D Company, led by Dawood Ibrahim, and the Haqqani Network. So for some background on the D Company, this is an organization that started out smuggling gold. Dawood Ibrahim moved up to higher level crimes, including extortion and providing assassinations for pay. He eventually expanded his operations to drug trafficking. In the 80s, he used his ownership of a number of shipping and trucking lines to smuggle heroin from Pakistan to India. And then through this smuggling ring, he grew in his business into a global smuggling empire with networks throughout South Asia, the Middle East, and much of Africa. So D Company used their wealth to fund their own terrorist operations. For instance, they were behind the Bombay bombings in 1993. But they also used it to fund other terrorist organizations. So they had strong connections with Al-Qaeda in the early 2000s, and Al-Qaeda used D Company to help them smuggle some of their fighters from Pakistan to Afghanistan after the US intervention in 2001. So this is, again, an example of terrorist groups utilizing each other's strengths to benefit each other. So D Company had strong networks and strong control of a particular sphere of influence that Al-Qaeda wanted to exploit. And because they had shared goals, because they shared a lot of the same ideologies, D Company allowed Al-Qaeda to use their trafficking lines in order to smuggle their fighters into their territory. They also provided financial support to Lashkar-e-Taiba for a number of their operations throughout the 2000s. Then with the Haqqani Network, this is an organization that was started by a wealthy family that were landowners along the Fatah region that bordered both Afghanistan and Pakistan along the Durand Line. They had been engaging in smuggling operations for a long time, since even before World War II. So around the 1980s, they had already developed into a major smuggling franchise where they facilitated a number of drug trafficking and weapons trafficking operations for the Mujahideen, which were also like-minded militants that shared a lot of the same ideologies. They were a major component in bringing about the global trafficking pipeline for arms and narcotics that blew up around the 80s and expanded to this day to be the largest narcotics trafficking pipeline in the world. And under the leadership of the Haqqani Network, Haqqani Network's founder's son, Sirajuddin Haqqani, this network grew even larger to become a major conglomerate of both licit and illicit enterprise. And when the Taliban took over in August of 2021, Sirajuddin became Afghanistan's interior minister. And then now we have Haqqani Network members in key positions throughout the Afghan government handling internal security. So with the crime terror hybrid organizations, we see them engaging in both illicit and licit revenue streams. So a number of illicit revenue streams that are very common is extortion, which I went into a bit, and extorting businesses operating in their sphere of influence, taxing them regularly in order to allow them to continue their operations. Kidnapping for ransom is a major one throughout Africa, and it's also growing in other regions. Human trafficking, also a major one in Africa, sub-Saharan Africa, usually very prominent in West Africa. And then narcotics we already went into, gems and mineral trafficking we already went into, and weapon smuggling. And then what they'll do is they'll start engaging in illicit enterprise in order to launder their illicit funds and make it much harder for security agencies to freeze their funds or identify illegal activity. So they'll be investing in commercial real estate, residential real estate. A colleague of mine talks about how he's an expert on Al-Shabaab, and Al-Shabaab have been investing in a number of mansions, in a number of large single-family homes, because this is less likely to arouse suspicion by security services. And they have these long-term investments in order to launder their funds. And when they need to get some emergency money for a particular operation, they'll try to sell the property and then use those funds for whatever illicit activity they're engaging in. Import-export business is also very popular, especially because they can use this illicit activity in order to promote illegal smuggling operations. So that's why you'll see a lot of these hybrid organizations investing in trucking lines and other types of import-export businesses. They've even invested in the stock market. Al-Qaeda had major investments in the stock market throughout the 2000s that they used to launder their illicit funds. And increasingly in the past decade, we're seeing them turn towards cryptocurrency, which we'll go into later in this presentation. So some examples of how these groups engage in illicit investments. D Company owns over 50 properties around the world. This includes shopping malls, plazas, high-end homes, hotels, and they invest in a number of businesses like import-export, even the entertainment industry. They had a Bollywood-linked business that they were running for a long time. And this is an industry that a lot of security agencies wouldn't even consider to look into as far as terrorist organizations engaging in. But that's precisely why they invest in these businesses, because they're seemingly legitimate and seemingly not associating with anything criminal. And so they'll clean their illicit earnings through investment in these businesses. And on top of that, they make illicit profit. So adding to the funds they have to fund terrorist attacks or to give funding to other terrorist organizations. In the case of the Haqqani network, they have their hands in a lot of the same types of industries D Company has: import-export, real estate, and construction. As I mentioned previously, they engage in a lot of gem mining, which involves a lot of construction operations, of course. So the Haqqani network is a great example of how these organizations use illicit fronts or illicit operations in order to surreptitiously conduct illicit activity. So for example, acetic anhydride is the precursor used to refine heroin from opium. It is also a chemical used in a lot of legal above board medicine in hospitals. So in order to secretly gather more acetic anhydride for heroin trafficking and heroin refining, a Haqqani network invests in hospitals, and then they'll purchase more acetic anhydride than is necessary, and then they'll use all of the surplus AA to refine heroin. But on paper, it looks like a completely legitimate purchase. So with these crime terror hybrid organizations and with the growth in connectivity between terrorist organizations and criminal organizations, we've seen much more well-financed terrorist organizations. And with that, of course, is a lot of threats, but it also presents a lot of opportunities for exploitation. So these organizations have a number of vulnerabilities that can be exploited. For instance, the larger they are, the larger their paper trail is. And when you have a large paper trail, any infiltration in it can lead to a massive benefit of freezing those funds. So a great way to do this is to identify the financial network, identify financial agents engaging in any part of these operations, and then if you're able to freeze those funds, or if you're able to access the financial agents, you can yield significant intelligence that could potentially dismantle the entire financing operation of the organization. So a great example of this is a former Al-Qaeda operative provided testimony in a New York court in order to gain immunity. This led to security agents uncovering $50 million in Al-Qaeda funds. It also led to them uncovering 6 other high-yield accounts linked to the original account. And after they uncovered the other 6 accounts, they identified a complex network of a number of banking subsidiaries that Al-Qaeda had invested in order to hide their funds. So all you need is one vulnerability within this vast network, and then the entire financial network can crumble. Another way to exploit these vulnerabilities is investigate the front companies. As discussed, there are a lot of front businesses within these hybrid organizations, and because of that, they're a great window into how to subvert the operations of the terrorist organization. So identify where the front companies are, identify who's operating the front companies, and once you're able to freeze those funds, or if you're able to shut down those operations, it can also lead to shutting down the entire financial stream of this terrorist organization. So switching gears to how these organizations are investing in modern technology in order to increase their finances, a lot of terrorist organizations are turning towards cryptocurrency and the darknet. So just a quick background on how cryptocurrency works. Cryptocurrency works over a blockchain. Blockchain technology is when you have a number of computer nodes that are all connected through an intranet, where each node, each computer is connected to another. And you have data miners who are basically validators of transactions, and they will ensure if person A is sending money to person B, you have a data miner who will ensure person A has the funds that they claim, and then they will ensure that the funds reached person B. And they will add that information onto what's called a blockchain, which is this image right here. And this blockchain is basically a public ledger that gets added to the cryptocurrency, so that everybody who is engaging in this cryptocurrency can see the blockchain and can see this part of the transaction, in order to ensure that no fraudulent activity is occurring, in order to ensure that the money is actually transferring from one person to the other. This is a novel system that doesn't involve any centralized banking system, yet because of the technology, because of the assurances within the technology, people are able to trust that the funds they're sending to somebody else will arrive at that destination. And if they are receiving the funds, they can be assured that that the data miners have validated it. And this also, because it's not on a centralized server, because it involves all of these nodes, it anonymizes the transactions so that people engaging in cryptocurrency transactions can remain entirely anonymous. For those of you familiar with the Hawala system, it operates in a much similar way, where you have person A trying to send money to person B. They give their money to the Hawaladar X, who will then either physically hand the money to Hawaladar M, or they will update their ledger to show that they have less money and Hawala M has more money. And then the Hawala M will then give their money to person B. The Waladars are very similar to the data miners in that they're all keeping a public ledger to identify where the money is going without necessarily transferring any money physically. So how are terrorists using cryptocurrency? Well, the first significant way is they're requesting untraceable donations to their organizations. So this is a real advertisement from a Daesh-linked website. After Daesh lost their territory in the early 2010s, they had to find new ways of getting revenue. They could no longer sell antiquities on the black market or pressure businesses to give them, toll taxes. So they started investing in online operations to request donations. But of course, it's illegal to donate to terrorist organizations. So their best approach is to turn towards cryptocurrency, or in this case, Bitcoin. So a number of Daesh-affiliated websites started requesting people send donations in the form of Bitcoin. One case study we can look at is of Zubia Shanaz. She is a 27-year-old Long Island, New York lab technician, and she applied to 6 credit cards from 6 different banks and loans using falsified information, and she was able to receive over $62,000. She then converted that money to Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies in order to not arouse suspicion. Then she sent that money through crypto exchanges to a number of Daesh operatives in a number of regions, Pakistan, China, and Turkey. Another example of this is this real advertisement that was on Twitter. We have this account Al Sadaka saying, if anyone has a Bitcoin ATM in your area, you can send money to the Mujahideen 100% anonymously with cash. It's really that simple. And then they give you access to this Bitcoin website where you can identify Bitcoin ATMs. So there are a number of cases out there of extremist link organizations and websites asking people to send money and convert it to Bitcoin, convert it to another cryptocurrency in order to send the money anonymously. Thankfully, in the years since this started, Bitcoin has become somewhat more regulated. So in 2015, they introduced KYC protocols. This stands for Know Your Customer Verification. This stems from the 2001 Patriot Act in the US, which requires banks operating in the United States to follow ID requirements. So Bitcoin, wanting to lose the reputation of being associated with criminal activity, wanted to gain a better reputation. So they started to cooperate with a lot of banks, and this enabled them to convert their cryptocurrency to fiat hard currency. So if Bitcoin holders wanted to exchange their Bitcoins for fiat currency, they would need to submit official identity documents, and it would need to be validated in order to proceed with that conversion. So this could be a driver's license or a passport. And then this enabled Bitcoin to increase their value, improve their reputation, since the Bitcoin could be converted to a more stable currency, and therefore the cryptocurrency itself became much less volatile. But there are a number of other popular cryptocurrencies that don't submit to the KYC protocols. Monero is a very prominent one that a lot of criminal organizations are using, and they're very committed to keeping their transactions anonymous, which helps benefit terrorist organizations and criminal organizations from using those funds and requesting donations. So how does this coordinate with the darknet? Well, the darknet is a region where terrorist organizations are increasingly going in order to fund their operations and in order to purchase illicit goods. So the darknet, for those of you who don't know, is an area of the internet that's not easily accessible to the wider public. You need somewhat of an expertise in order to access it. It's only reachable via a specialized encrypted network, most commonly the Tor browser. Tor browser websites end in the .onion URL instead of .com, for instance. This is not on the DNS root server. DNS root server enables you to pull a log of online activity. So it's not searchable in any search engine either. This makes it difficult for both the website host and the individual accessing the website to be found out. Tor browser is an encrypted proxy internet browsing tool that uses a number of relays in order to prevent any monitoring. So the user's information, such as the geolocation, IP address, and the host location, are all hidden. Now, it's important to note that Tor browser isn't always used for nefarious means. It's used for communication on chat rooms and forums. It's also a file and image hosting site location. And there's also a number of marketplaces. And over half of the darknet websites are actually legal. It's used by people who are wary of advertisers tracking their habits. It's used by people in states with internet restrictions, and it's used by journalists who want to communicate with their sources without them getting their information observed by security agencies. So it's not always used for criminal activity. But when it is used for criminal activity, 75% of that is using it to access the darknet marketplace. So what is on the darknet marketplace? This is a real screen grab of a website that's thankfully no longer in operation, called Silk Road. This was one of the first darknet marketplaces in operation. And as you can see on the top left, Tor is telling you the number of relays it took before it reached the final site. So from your browser's location, it traveled to the Netherlands, then to Italy, then to the United States, and then 3 more unknown relays that it doesn't even tell the user until it finally reached the site. So as you can see, it would be very difficult for security agencies to know where you're coming from and who's reaching the website. Now, in addition to selling narcotics and other illicit goods, people sell weapons over the darknet. And as you can see on the bottom here, they're taking great care to ship their packages discreetly in a number of parcels so it wouldn't arouse suspicion. And already the darknet marketplace is being utilized by terrorist organizations to access weapons to fund attacks. In the 2016 Munich terrorist attacks, Ali David Sonbali purchased a Glock on the darknet with a removed serial number, which is also very common on the darknet and makes it much harder to trace. In 2018 in Durban, South Africa, there was an attack on an older couple that was hiking. ISIS cell killed this couple and stole their credit cards in order to purchase Bitcoin. And then they used those Bitcoin to purchase weapons on the darknet, including rifles, crossbows, and swords. And also, concerningly, people are purchasing fraudulent identity documents over the darknet in order to evade security, in order to cross borders illegally. So as you can see, this is another real advertisement for EU driver's licenses, IDs, passports, and they're accepting payment in Bitcoin. So again, a number of ways that people can hide their activity, both through cryptocurrency and through accessing the Tor browser and going on the darknet. So what are some ways that we can combat terrorist activity using cryptocurrency and the darknet? Well, first, we can work with cryptocurrency exchanges to track terrorist use. Bitcoin has already done this by submitting to the KYC protocols. A lot of these cryptocurrency exchanges believe that terrorist use is bad for their business. They don't want to be associated with terrorist activity. So it's in their best interest to be seen as a reputable cryptocurrency. So they have a vested interest in keeping terrorists out of their marketplace as well, because they don't want their accounts to be shut down if it's found out that terrorists are using it. You can also promote international cooperation to take down these marketplaces. So in 2019, Interpol and the EU coordinated their law enforcement agencies from over 19 states to identify 247 high-value targets. Their cooperation led to shutting down 50 different illicit darknet websites. This included the prominent darknet marketplaces Wall Street Market and Valhalla. And the last thing we'll look into today is this case study on the Hansa Market. This is Hansa Market was another darknet marketplace that sold weapons, drugs, illicit identity documents, and a number of other nefarious things. So in June 2017, the Dutch police coordinated with the Lithuanian hosting provider, so the Lithuanian host that was hosting this website, and infiltrated this marketplace. But instead of shutting it down immediately, they allowed the operations to continue for a month while they collected the user data. The Dutch authorities used malware embedded in these transactions to gain access to users' IP addresses. So anytime somebody purchased an item from this marketplace, they would get a receipt. And if they opened the receipt, it contained malware that the Dutch authorities put in order to identify who was purchasing this item. They also were able to collect all the passwords used on this marketplace and find out if anybody used the same password on another darknet marketplace. And because of that, they were able to shut down a number of accounts that were operating on other marketplaces, and they locked a number of vendors out of their shops. And then they shared all the addresses that they were able to collect over that month to Europol in order to have Europol launch investigations into those individuals and shut down those accounts and confiscate any illegal items, weaponry, drugs that they purchased. So we can utilize data analytics on top of this to track these extremist sites that are calling for donations. This is similar to how advertisers will track consumer habits. They'll utilize AI and machine learning to identify particular images. For instance, that image I showed earlier of the Uncle Sam character with the Bitcoin, if you reverse image search that, you can find a number of areas where Daesh is trying to encourage people to donate. So you can automate searching social media on top of this and locate this extremist imagery. And then, of course, shutting down these sites and archiving them instead of just erasing them to study them into the future. And in addition to this, monitoring extremist social media groups calling for donations. And then you can map out these networks once you start monitoring them. So general conclusions, any effective counterterrorism strategy would require understanding the internal structure of a terrorist organization, knowing their partnerships, knowing the alliances they have, knowing their financial networks, finding out their licit and illicit revenue streams, finding their vulnerabilities for potential exploitation. Again, the larger they are, the more potential you have for exploiting these industries. And then security agencies on top of this should be monitoring identified terrorist communication channels for threats and identify weapons, collecting donations. On top of this, as evidenced in the last case study I provided, international cooperation is essential in gathering intelligence on darknet marketplaces. If it wasn't for the Lithuanian government coordinating with the Dutch government, they would not have gained access to the Hansa marketplace. It would not have been able to gather all that intelligence. And I would also recommend, on top of all of this, creating task forces where you involve fintech stakeholders to take down bad actors operating in this sphere. And with that, thank you so much for your time, and I'm looking forward to any questions.
Thank you, David, for the rich and insightful presentation. I think it was pretty comprehensive. You covered the growing cooperation between criminal and terrorist organizations, the vicious cycle really between terrorist activity and criminal activity, collaborations, drug trafficking, and how they're using cryptocurrency, the threat from the darknet marketplace, as you put it, and also lastly, you covered a few ways in which terrorist use of cryptocurrency and the darknet can be combated. Thank you for that. There are no questions in the chat yet. I think they are still coming in. This webinar is a short one. We just have 1 hour for the webinar. Okay, I see a question there. Yeah, I'll come to that question in a short while. So please continue posting your questions. So let me start off with a question on the Haqqani network that you mentioned in your presentation about the revenue streams, licit and illicit means they're collected. Can you help us sort of understand how the Haqqani network sends or receives money from outside of the region, of the core region that you discussed, Afghanistan, Pakistan? I think the Haqqani network is also like, it's also of interest to the Indian government, for example. And it's one of the terrorist organizations that the Indian government has been very mindful about. So how do they sort of like send funds across the border, say to India or to the wider region?
Well, the Haqqani network is heavily involved in the drug and arms trafficking pipeline that originates in Afghanistan and, as I alluded to in my presentation, expands to the entire world. So there is a number of pathways that these smuggling routes take. Just very briefly, there is the Balkan route where it travels through commonly Turkey and then goes on to Balkan countries and then to Western Europe. There's the southern route, and that's usually via land borders. So this is they can they're engaged in not just moving drugs, but moving weapons, moving potentially even funds. There's also the southern route where they are able to smuggle usually via maritime shipping and air travel. And then there is, the southern route goes from usually Afghanistan and Pakistan over to Iran, and then from Iran, using maritime shipping over to Southern Europe, over to Eastern Africa, and then via air travel, they can get to the entire world. And then the northern route is probably the least common of the three, and that's where they're likely to go through Central Asia and over to Eastern Europe. That involves land trafficking as well as maritime trafficking. So that's a way that they engage in smuggling operations. So this usually involves narcotics trafficking, gem and mineral trafficking. But to talk about how they engage in financing operations, they usually focus on the smuggling operations to get the financing. So via connections with other extremist groups and that are operating throughout Western Europe, they'll often exchange funds using the Hawala system. So Hawala system is extremely common in that region. I imagine you're probably familiar with it in Singapore. And as I said in my presentation, it's a prominent way to exchange funds without money actually passing, physically from one person to the next.
Yes, that's true. Like even usually there's a migrant population, this large South Asian population, places like Singapore and Malaysia, and just to sort of like bypass the process. I mean, it's not just terrorists that use this method. It's just a lot of just ordinary people just find it easier to just use the Hawala system. You pay somebody in India, and then you collect that money back when you come to Singapore, Malaysia, or other countries in Southeast Asia. So yeah. Thank you. Yeah. I have a I'll go to the question in the chat box. I think the first question might be of relevance to you. This is from Ruben Das. So he's asking, have you seen evidence of crime terror nexus, in particular drug money being used to finance terror groups in Southeast Asia? In your presentation, I know that you mentioned about Myanmar's Shan state, where,
Yeah.
rebel like Konka militia, they are using drug proceeds. Is that still the case, or are there other examples from Southeast Asia that can tell us?
Yeah, well, the Sam Gore organization is still heavily engaged in that region, as far as I'm aware. It's a region I have less expertise on, so I don't know too many other organizations operating there. But yes, I do know that Sam Gore is probably the largest synthetic drug trafficker in the world, and I do know that they are heavily involved in smuggling operations throughout Southeast Asia. Trying to think other groups I've covered in that area. But I mean, on top of that, there are a lot of Al-Qaeda affiliates operating throughout the world that even include in Southeast Asia, and other terrorist groups operating where they rely on their wide networks in order to smuggle their funds to other cells operating. So yes, I believe that is occurring in that region.
Thank you, David. Yeah, in Southeast Asia, one group, I'm not sure whether you have come across this, is Abu Sayyaf. I think will qualify as a hybrid type of organization. I think you had several categories. I think maybe you will fit into the hybrid category.
Yeah.
I think the other question that Ruben Das has, I'm not sure whether this is something that you look at. He's asking about weapons being trafficked. Is that something that you sort of look at? If not, we can move to other questions.
With the Al-Shabaab question.
Yes. Yeah.
I don't believe they're engaging in that. I know Al-Shabaab focuses a lot on human trafficking. That's a major part of their revenue. But I don't believe they've done much with drones, or at least I haven't seen that personally.
Okay, yeah. I wanted to ask also about the Indian government's decision 2016. Was a major legislation that they passed. It was a major change to the approach that they were taking with regard to terrorism financing. They demonetized, as in like the bigger bills were all made unusable overnight. And one of the reasons that the Indian government had was that, terrorists organizations across the border in Pakistan and Afghanistan have a lot of Indian currency, which they were going to use for terrorist activities. And so the state decided to demonetize overnight, essentially. So is there a case where terrorists use, as in like you covered cryptocurrency and other ways in which they're financing? So do they also like stock up on cash and then like try to use that for terrorist funding?
Definitely. Hard currency is extremely useful, especially in a lot of regions where there's less security. Hard currency is much more reliable. I don't know if devaluing particular bills will do anything to stop that, though, because I'm sure they, from what I've seen, they have a variety of currencies. And as I said, the Hawala system is still a extremely prominent way of trafficking funds and financing their operations. And with that, they don't even require any hard currency at all. And I'm sure the Hawala Dars, they often engage with people who are above board and are able to extract any type of currency they wish. So as long as the Hawala system is in operation, then there's little chance it's going anywhere, because it's used all over the world. I don't think getting any particular currency out of circulation will subvert that.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah. So also wanted to ask about cryptocurrency. Is it like preferred over the traditional financial systems by terrorist groups. Initially, I think there was a lot of interest from the Taliban when they took over. I think there was a lot of interest from Taliban regime to exploit cryptocurrency. But do they have the wherewithal, the technological capabilities to, and the knowledge, the technical knowledge to actually sort of like use it fully?
It depends on the cell. I know that Al Qaeda is very decentralized these days, and a number of cells are less technologically equipped than others. So those that are less capable probably rely more on Hawala than cryptocurrency, but it is still being utilized by terrorist groups, and I think it's likely to be utilized more frequently, not less frequently, as it becomes more normalized and more accessible. So from what I've seen, it's becoming much more utilized, and the capabilities are increasing just because the ease of accessing cryptocurrencies are pretty low. Basically, all you need is a smartphone. And if anybody is able to access a smartphone, they're able to access cryptocurrency and trade it. So what I think we will see is the integration of Hawala transactions with cryptocurrency transactions. So those who have the lower technological capabilities will probably use the Hawala system, and then that will connect with people who are investing in cryptocurrency who have more access to technology. So while we have a number of ISIS websites still online requesting donations, people will be able to send that money in, and then if they're trying to get money to one of their provinces, if that province is operating in an area they don't have good cell service, good internet, they can just shift that to the Hawala system and easily fund that cell.
Are there problems with sort of like liquidating cryptocurrency and and cashing it and trying to use it for funding terrorist activities? Is there a difficulty there for terrorist groups?
Not particularly, because as I mentioned, there are a number of cryptocurrencies that don't require you to share your identity documents in order to convert those funds. So the only issue is when you get to converting it to fiat currency, right? So very few of them are able to convert to fiat currency from cryptocurrency. But as I said earlier, this is where the integration of a Hawala system takes place, because if you have a Hawala dar operating who has a clean record, they can connect with somebody who's using cryptocurrency and, for instance, sending them funds with Monero, which can be converted to fiat currency. But then Hawala dar can then take that Monero funding and convert it to Bitcoin using their identity documents. And then, I'm sorry, they can convert the Monero to Bitcoin and convert the Bitcoin to a hard currency using their identity documents. So as long as it's enough, steps away from the criminals involved, it's fairly easy for them to convert those funds.
There's a question from Adlini about the KYC verification that Bitcoin now requires. Is this limit? She's asking if this is limited to exchanging to fiat currency in the US only, and are there similar systems elsewhere?
Excuse me. This is a requirement for, as far as I'm aware, any crypto marketplace. So I think the marketplace, the Bitcoin marketplace, is operating in the US. We're the first to incorporate this, but if you want to convert to euro, if you want to convert to any fiat currency, you need to do so over a crypto marketplace, and every crypto marketplace requires people to submit to the KYC protocols. So this is now being implemented globally in every industry where they can convert to a hard currency.
Thank you for that. Yeah. Also wanted to ask about the front companies you mentioned. Can you give us some examples of what these front companies sort of like look like? I mean, if you're able to tell us the names, will be good. But I mean, if it's not possible, then you can just mention like which industry, what type of business front do these things have?
Well, I gave an example of there was a Bollywood-linked production company that the D company was investing in. So this was a company that had produced a number of films. The people involved in the production company outside of D company had no idea who was funding their operations. They just knew they had, they basically had a manager and owner who was a low-level operative within D company who had a clean record. They gave him a lot of funds, kind of turned him into sort of a entertainment industry hotshot, and fabricated this image of him in order to make it seem like this business was above board. So the way to identify these type of businesses is, one, look at the owners of the companies, look at the people who are operating the company. Do they have a history in that industry? Do they have a history of having the financing in order to own a business that large? And other examples, shipping companies are very common with narcotics trafficking syndicates. So look at the people who own the business. Were they involved in that industry for a long time? What was their previous job before that, and what were they earning, and what are they earning now? That's a good way to identify if there's any red flags that show this person probably isn't legitimately owning this company. They're just being put in because they have a clean record and they have enough plausible steps away from the criminal organization to not have any doubts by security agencies.
Thank you, David, for answering the questions. I don't think there are other questions coming in. I don't see any other questions in the chat, so I would assume that there are no questions from our audience, no other questions. But if there are other questions, pressing questions, I hope we can write to you, and if it's possible, you can sort of respond to us. But really, thank you for your rich and insightful presentation. It was really useful. I'm afraid that's all the time we have, and thank you from me and also from everyone here at ICPVTR for your attention and for your questions. We hope you found the presentation and discussion useful. There will be a QR code flashed on the screen after this for you to fill up the feedback form. So hope you can help us to fill out the feedback form later on. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much.